My name is Cheryl Kubiak, and I am the Dean of the School of Social Work at Wayne State University. And I am very, very happy to introduce Dr. Trina Shanks today for this invited lecture. This is one of a series of lectures that the school is giving this term that meet our diversity, equity, and inclusion theme, and also provides information for our students, our community, and our alumni. So I want to talk a little bit about Dr. Shanks and her experience. She is our neighbor, both literally and figuratively. Dr. Shanks resides in the city of Detroit, but works at the University of Michigan. She is the Harold Johnson Collegiate Professor and Director of the University of Michigan School of Social Work Community Engagement Center. She is also the new director of she's the director of a newly launched center called the Center for Equitable Family and Community Well-Being. Dr. Shanks has a wealth of information from her research and practice wisdom around asset building and increasing financial capability. And what she has to offer us today will not only benefit us as social workers and how we think about our own personal finances, but also about how to use financial capability as part of our community development strategies. We're hoping that her lecture today and her involvement with our school will help us in some of the endeavors that we will take in terms of building out capability for finances among students across the university. The School of Social Work is involved with Matt Rolling and others from a business school in terms of thinking about creating a center that will actually be an asset to our students around thinking about financial capability and debt reduction. So we look forward to working with Dr. Shanks in the future and helping us to think about this, because it's quite wonderful that such a neighbor is such a resource. So Dr. Shanks has an agenda that she has that is going to include some lecture, some breakouts, some question and answer. So please, without any ado, let me hand this microphone over to her. But again, please keep your microphones muted and write comments or questions in the chat box so that Dr. Johns can organize the question and answer period productively. Thank you very much. And Dr. Shanks, please begin.
All right, can everybody see the screen okay? Good. Okay, well then, thank you so much, Dean Kubiak and Betsy and all of those who helped plan and organize this event. I'm really excited to be able to share some of this because it's taking information from several different types of work that I've done and putting it all in one place. And so hopefully you'll find it helpful. The title is Show Me the Money, Why Financial Capability Matters for Social Workers and the Communities They Serve. So I'd like to start by just introducing the grand challenges for social work. Many of you may have already heard about these. But they're a project of the American Academy of Social Work and Social Welfare, and it's really to show that social progress can be powered by science, a kind of a call to action for social workers to come together to tackle our nation's toughest social problems. And they actually fall into three big buckets: individual and family well-being, that includes things like positive youth development, ending violence, and then it has a stronger social fabric, which includes things like smart decarceration and reducing homelessness. And then the category that I'm going to talk mostly about today, a just society that fights exclusion and marginalization and tries to create a sense of belonging and promote trust and offer pathways for social and economic progress. And in particular, the two grand challenges most closely related to this workshop or talk that I'm giving today is one, financial capability and asset building for all. So it's thinking about innovations to bolster lifelong income generation and asset accumulation and ways to expand financial inclusion and increase financial capability. That's kind of the first half of the lecture I'm going to give. And the second grand challenge is reducing extreme economic inequality. Even though I'm involved with what they call FCAB, Financial Capability and Asset Building, I actually help lead the Reduce Extreme Economic Inequality Grand Challenge. So it's not just that there is inequality, but it actually has been increasing over time. And so what can we do as social workers and as a society to look at things like tax benefits accounts, home ownership, policies that will help reduce this extreme economic inequality? And you'll learn more about both of these over the course of the lecture. And just generally, the learning objectives is really to identify components of financial well-being and financial capability and how they relate to social work, describe strategies for building financial capability in low-income communities, and then hopefully each of you, after listening, will come up with a goal or an idea or a concept that you have for improving financial capability, either in your own personal finances or in a community context. So let's get going. I hope today's talk will be broadly relevant. So not just for one constituency, but for students, to make sure that you don't take on too much debt and you can start your careers more financially solvent. For practitioners, either to help your own personal finances so that you aren't at a position where you're struggling economically and are in the same position as the client. So you both are having difficulties, but you can kind of get a little more financial security, and then you could be in a position to help others. And then for community leaders to think about what ways can we as a community deal with this financial inequality in Southeast Michigan and have some creative and innovative ways to make a difference. And then of course, if policymakers are on the line and they're interested, there's many suggested ideas and recommendations in the arena of policy. So, how are US households doing, and what is financial insecurity like in the United States? Over half of US households find it very difficult to cover the usual expenses and pay bills. More than half, if they had an unexpected financial emergency, and they don't have enough saved in emergency savings to be able to deal with these expenses. And so this is kind of some survey questions that ask about financial insecurity. In particular, half had a loss of income in the prior year. Most have had difficulty meeting basic needs after a financial shock. Most have less than 9 days of living expenses and liquid savings. So if they lost their income, they could only survive for 9 days. And all of this data is pre-pandemic. We don't even have the survey data now for what is going to happen with the COVID-19 virus and all of the unemployment and the sectors that have been so strongly affected and the uncertainty that has come from these times, as well as the racial and economic and political uncertainty we've had lately. So all of this data is before all of this that happened in the past year, but we were already pretty financially insecure as a country. And so material hardship, so difficulty being able to pay your bills, keep your lights on, to having a large amount of your income go toward rent or housing. This is associated with a lot of things that social workers do work in. So lack of social support, increased intimate partner violence, mental health problems, physical health problems, family stress, child maltreatment, poor developmental outcomes for children. So if you are financially insecure and you have material hardship, it's not just the economic consequences, but it's correlated and associated with a lot of other things that we as social workers would like to prevent or help alleviate. And then there's also portions of the population that are more likely to be financially insecure. So African-American and Latinx or Latino households, female-headed households with young children, and households with members who have disabilities. And when you look particularly in Michigan at asset poverty, so do you have enough money to support yourself at the poverty level for 3 months in your liquid assets, so things you have in stocks and bonds or money in the bank? And so 37% of white households in Michigan would be considered liquid asset poor, and then almost twice that in African-American households and about 61% of Latinx households. So not only is it prevalent in Michigan, but there is huge disparities by race and ethnicity. And so the question is, what do households need to be financially secure? So if we have financial security, how can we get to the point of being more financially secure? And so some definitions are being able to consistently meet basic needs, and to maintain consumption when you have some sort of economic shock, so some unexpected expense. These are kind of what you think about as stability. But then you also want to move beyond stability to mobility, where you actually are building financial and productive assets, you're building wealth, you're at a point where you can get ahead and have security, not just to get by month to month or week to week, but to be able to plan for your future and maybe even for the next generation. So stability is at least not getting behind, but mobility means you're actually moving ahead and being in a stronger financial position. So obviously we want people to be stable, but even more so over time, we want people to have mobility. And so when you think about financial security, it really covers a lot of different things. So it's about not just income, but it's being able to use safe and affordable financial services, saving and building assets, being able to access credit and manage debt, protecting assets you have with insurance, and being financial capable is the definition really is having the knowledge, skills, and opportunities to make good decisions. So one thing is learning. And so financial education is good, but you don't just want to have the knowledge. You want to actually be able to navigate the financial systems and make good decisions. And then once you hopefully have a little bit of a nest egg or emergency savings, to save it and then to be able to protect it so that it isn't snatched away by unscrupulous business practices or some bad loan or something like that. And then over time, you want to be able to build assets and maybe even create jobs. So you want to go from just learning and having the information to be able to do it and practice it and manage whatever financial resources you have or whatever debt you have, so you can get to a point where you're more financially secure. So all of those things together are what makes financial capability. So the skills and the opportunities and the knowledge to make good decisions, financial decisions. And so when you're thinking about household financial security, what sort of things do you look for? What are signs of trouble? How do you know if someone isn't doing well? And so it's always important when you think about financial circumstances that really you're looking at households, not individuals. That's really the economic unit of analysis. And so one way to think about it is to look at an income statement. In a given month, how much comes in terms of income and how much goes out in terms of expenses. And when you think of income in the household finance arena, things that are good as cash. So if you happen to have SNAP or EBT card, that's a way to pay for expenses. So you don't have to use cash. If you have Section 8 housing, that's a way to pay for housing without having to use cash. But all of those resources are what you have coming in terms of income. And then you have to see what you pay out in terms of expenses.
It's Miss Jackson.
And if everybody can mute
I'll be right
themselves,
there.
that would be really helpful. Okay, so, and then in addition, when you're thinking about household finances and income, what happens month to month? So some household members come and go. And so if someone is an earner and then leaves, or you're in a relationship and then break up, that's one thing. So people can enter and exit the household. And then you have volatility. So because of maybe you work seasonally, or maybe you have a big expense that happens once or twice a year. And those are things that can make a big difference in your income statements, if you will. There could be timing mismatches, so that you may have insurance that's due every 6 months. And if you aren't saving each month to put aside, when you get that bill, it might be tough to pay it given your monthly income. And so these are all the things that lead to month variability and also can make managing your finances difficult. I mean, on average, people have about 2.7 spikes. So they may have an increase in income for some reason, or they have a dip in income. And all of those things can help either support financial security or make it more difficult. And then when you're getting away from the income statement, you're getting to the balance sheet. This is when you talk about net worth. So you take everything that you own, all of your assets, and subtract everything that you owe, all of your liabilities. And so there are things that's called good debt that you're expecting to get a return on, like an education, like a home, but there's also bad debt. So if you're just, making your credit card go up every month just by buying random things. And even though a car can be helpful for transportation, in terms of maintaining its value over time, it's not is considered a good debt in that regard. So if you can pay as much up front as opposed to paying it over time, that's better if possible. But anyways, if you take everything you own minus everything you owe, this is your net worth. And that gives you a sense of what your current circumstances are as a household. So what you really want is financial slack. So you want to have more money coming in terms of income than you have going out in terms of expenses. So when you have greater slack, that means you can use that extra money to save, to pay down debt, to smooth consumption. So if you do have a shock, you can have some emergency savings. And if you don't have slack, then that means you have to spend down your assets. That means you have to get more debt and you're getting more and more behind. So in order to increase the slack, you want to reduce your expenses and increase your income. And so some red flags for a household is if your housing burden is more than 40%. So if your rent or mortgage plus utilities is more than 40% of your gross monthly income, that's a problem because it means you're paying a lot of money into housing and you have less money for other things. Similarly, if you have a debt to income ratio that's more than 20%, so all the money you pay toward debt every month is more than 20% of your monthly gross income, then that could be a problem. So if you have more money going to credit cards, student loans, auto loans, other loans, or even child support, that means too large portion of your income is going to pay down debt, so you have less to save and to pay for your ongoing expenses. So those are kind of ways of thinking about it. And in terms of what can social workers do, there's always financial education. So there's can be low touch, just an hour or so, just to give some initial information to introduce concepts. It could be delivered in groups or online. There's all sorts of resources now to do this. There's apps, there's games, there's webinars. But it's best to not just give random information. It's best when it's tailored to a particular audience. So if everyone is a student or everyone is a parent or everyone is nearing retirement, then you would kind of make your information kind of tailored to the audience that you have. It's also better when it's delivered just in time. So if you're about to buy a house, that's the best time to learn about, housing financing or mortgages. If you're getting ready to start a business, that's a good time to go through a business education class to make sure you understand how to best use your finances or what kind of loans to get. If you're getting ready to buy a refrigerator, it's good to look at what all the prices are and what the different options are so you can get the best deal possible. And then of course, it's always better if it could be culturally relevant and economically sensitive. So you don't want to talk about buying boats and yachts and fur coats if you're dealing with the audience that is very, very poor. And you don't want to be talking about food stamps and evictions and things that aren't relevant if you have more of a middle class or a working class population. So you want to make sure that it's economically sensitive and relevant. And then if it's a group that's majority African-American or Latinx or whatever group, that you want to make sure that it can be culturally relevant. And even better, if you can have someone from that group to be part of the presentation or part of the preparing of materials to make sure that you're not missing something. But that's kind of financial education, providing kind of basic information. But going beyond financial education, there's financial counseling. And this is more directive than financial education. It's usually focused on budgeting and debt management. And it's usually for people who are facing some sort of crisis. They have so much debt that they can't pay off their creditors. They're getting called all the time about paying debt. They're in danger of losing their home. They're really in crisis. So financial counseling is actually, how do we get you out of this difficult situation so you can be back on track and reducing debt and increasing income over time. And so if you want financial counseling as an individual, or if you want to point someone to financial counseling, you want to look for someone who's a accredited counselor. So and you'll see at the end, there's NFCC and FCAA. And so these are accreditation that train people to actually do financial counseling for people who are in crisis. So this is for people who are in a very difficult financial situation or in danger of losing their home or bankruptcy, helping someone in that immediate situation that kind of help them know what their options are and to provide some directive coaching to help get them out of that crisis situation. And then there's financial coaching. financial coaching is not when you're in crisis, but it's helping you to understand what your goals are. Where'd you like to go as a family? What would you like to do in the future? And then help take action steps to help you get there. And then meet every 2 or 3 months to hold the person accountable to make sure that they're reaching their goals and action steps. And this is not as directive as financial counseling is. It's usually providing information and options and then letting the families decide what they want to do to meet their needs. So again, financial education, providing this information. Financial counseling is when someone's in crisis. Financial coaching is really helping people meet their long-term goals. Okay, what are ways to help people increase their financial security? So this term slack is coming up again. So in the short term, you want people just to increase slacks. You want on a week-to-week or month-to-month basis for any income that comes in to exceed their expenses. And there's lots of ways to increase income and decrease expenses, but you want to have slack, because if you don't have slack, if your expenses is always more than your income, then it's hard to get ahead. But once you get past the point of having at least some slack in your weekly or monthly budget, then you can start to actually think about some long-term goals. So reducing debt, building assets, and making long-term investments. So short-term, just getting slack so you're not always living paycheck to paycheck, always having more expenses as income. And then once you get to that point where you have slack, then you can think about these long-term things. And so if you're working with clients, it's really good to use simple guides, worksheets to help clients understand what their income is coming in and out, sometimes helping them, keep a budget for a month or two to kind of see where money's coming and going, helping them to manage debt. And then you want to help clients identify financial goals, maybe even related to other goals. So if you have more slack and you're not so concerned about paying bills every month, maybe you'll be less stressed. Maybe you won't have to work extra hours. You can spend more time with your family. Maybe it provide more opportunities for your children. So it's not just about the financial goals themselves, but what can those financial goals help you achieve in the rest of your life? And then you always want to help people have achievable actions. So it's always better to be simple and to offer simple rules of thumb. So for increasing income, one way may be to maximize public assistance so you get everything you're eligible for. So whether it's EITC, Medicaid, SNAP and WIC, Section 8, whatever you're eligible for, and you can go to benefits.gov, different places to make sure that any benefits you're eligible for, you're getting. That's a way to increase income, because the money you're getting from benefits means you don't have to use that cash for something else. You may want to have informal employment. And again, this isn't recommended for everyone, because sometimes these things can get you in trouble and they're not always as helpful as you want. But if you really need additional income, informal employment through micro enterprise, selling things on eBay, providing childcare for people who need it, maybe providing some sort of part-time professional services, or even do some of the gig economy by being a driver or shopping or other freelance work. And again, you don't want to always be reliant on having additional supplemental income and informal employment, because it might take you away from your long-term career goals. But if you need to increase income in the short term, these are some suggestions. And then you may want to think about different types of jobs or different types of career paths with different benefit packages. And sometimes if you're a veteran or you fall in particular categories, you might be able to be eligible for particular training or work opportunities. And again, this is a way to increase income. And then when you're thinking about reducing expenses or debt, oftentimes medical debt sometimes can be written off. If you work out a deal with the healthcare provider. Again, you want to go to a accredited credit counselor that can help maybe.
Dr. Shanks, you're muted.
How long have I been muted? I'm sorry.
Just like 30 seconds or less.
Okay, well, I'm on reducing expenses now, and I'm not sure how I got muted, but I apologize for that. So reducing expenses, maybe writing off medical debt, working with a credit counselor to reduce the amount of debt you owe or the principal that you owe. You may want to consider different renting options or reducing your housing burden. And then, of course, if it's possible to refinance, consolidate loans, maybe shift to credit cards with lower rates. These are all ways to reduce expenses. And then once you have increased income and reduced expenses and you have more slack, then you can start to save. It's always good to have an account as opposed to saving in your home or informally. Deposits are sticky because you have to make an effort to take the money out. So making a deposit means that you're more likely to keep it in savings. It's always better to have savings that's automatic, some sort of direct deposit that automatically comes from your check. So you don't have to think about it or do it. It just happens automatically. Sometimes people join savers programs, or you can start to save for a particular reason. So you may want to start an emergency fund. You may have to make a large purchase of a new machine or a new computer, or maybe an important event coming up, so a family vacation or something like that. So you may start saving for a specific reason, but then once you've reached that goal or purchased that machine or had your event, then maybe you could keep on saving, and that can be a way to get started. And it's really important, these things. So it's not just, oh, wouldn't it be great to save? But the difference it makes if you have an emergency is really important. So if your car breaks down and you need a $350 repair, if you have emergency savings, then you dip into your savings, you pay for the repair, you don't have to pay any interest, you don't have to pay any loans, and the cost is the cost of repairs for $350. If you don't have emergency savings, but you do have a credit card, then you can put in your credit card, but if you don't pay it off that month, that means you have to pay back interest. So maybe rather than paying $350 over a 16-month period, you're paying $390. But the worst option is if you have to go to get a payday loan or one of those things, because you end up paying much, much higher interest rates and additional fees. So you pay a lot more for that $350 repair than if you had the money in savings. So if you can over time build slack, have a little more savings, then when you have an emergency, you could pay for it out of your own resources as opposed to having to pay for something on credit or go to a payday loan. So that's one of the really important reasons to have at least some slack and some savings so that you're not paying a lot of extra money for the thing that you need. And so now these are some of these basic rules of thumb I was talking about. So if you're helping someone or thinking about yourself, basic rules of thumb are helping someone distinguish between needs and wants. These are things that I have to pay, that I have to do in order to eat and survive from day to day, month to month. And the things that I just want, that maybe I can put off for a while to create that slack. And even a little slack makes a difference because you're not getting behind every month. If you have credit cards, it's always best to pay on balances that have the higher annual percentage rates, APRs. So if you have a credit card with a 19% annual credit rate, and then you have one with a 12%, you want to pay off that 19% one first. So then you're losing less money or having less to pay in interest over time. You want to avoid payday lenders and those kind of loans that have those high exorbitant interest rates. You want to try to opt out of overdraft protection if you can, because that means that you keep paying fees for things if you aren't paying attention to how much is in your account. You don't want to be overinsured where you're paying too much money, but you don't want to be underinsured. So if there's some sort of emergency with a car accident or a home repair, that you don't have what you need. And as mentioned before, always make saving as easy and automatic as possible. Direct deposit coming from your account, not things that you have to really work at, things that just happen automatically. Those are basic rules of thumb that are helpful to anybody. Once you have some slack and you want to do a little bit more, here's some more advanced rules of thumb. You want to pay off your credit card balance every month if you can, as opposed to holding over a balance each month, because that's when you have to pay the interest. If you can, have 3 months of expenses and savings so that you know that if you have an emergency or if you are in between jobs, you have enough to hold you over until you have that. If you can, follow the 50-30-20 rule. So 50 toward basic needs, 30% toward wants, and then 20% toward either debt reduction if you're in that mode, or toward saving and investing. If you are going to buy a home, rather than getting the cheapest loan possible, which is probably going to have higher rates, you want to be able to put a 20% down payment if possible. And you also want to be saving a portion of your money toward retirement. So these are advanced rules of thumb once you've gotten beyond just not having enough to survive month to month. Okay, I've said a whole lot, so I'm going to take a breath and pause for a second. And then point to ways as social workers, you may want to keep developing your skills so that you can move forward and get in this area if you'd like. So there's the Association for Financial Counseling and Planning Education. You can get certifications in financial counseling and coaching. And so those are nationally recognized, the trademark credentials. It can be part of your ongoing job that you're already doing someplace else, or it can be a way to help others in this area. There is the Center for Financial Social Work that offers CEUs through AASW. And then there's something called NeighborWorks. And it's a financial capability certification that's a little longer, really works around things like housing coaching and counseling. But again, these are ways if you want to get the training and the counseling, probably post MSW, to do this yourself. These are ways as social workers you can. All right, we're shifting now to talking about economic inequality. And it's really just the unequal distribution of income and opportunity between different groups in society. And because I lead the grand challenge to reduce extreme economic inequality, I spent a lot of time thinking about this. So just to put it into some context, in the top 1% in the United States are again close to having a quarter of total income. So those at the top are getting more and those at the bottom aren't. And to see exactly what that means, if you look at growth in US after-tax income inequality. And just to see what that means, if you're looking at wealth by quintiles, those at the top quintile not only are doing much better, those at the bottom quintile don't even have enough wealth to be in positive numbers. They have more debt than they have wealth. And so you have negative wealth in the bottom quintile. But the other thing to show is if you look recent Great Recession from 2007 to 2009 to post, those at the top have recovered and are doing just as well or better than they were before. Those at the bottom are doing worse. So those at the top, at the bottom quintile went from being negative $905 in debt to negative $6,000 in debt. Those in the second quintile went from having a net worth of $14,000 to half of that, about $7,000. Those in the third quintile didn't fully recover either. The only two quintiles that recovered was the top quintile and the second to last quintile. And that's mostly because they have more money in stocks and bonds. So as the stock market recovers, those at the top recover their wealth, but those in the bottom have most of their wealth in homes or in very minuscule savings. They weren't able to recover. And similarly, you can see that the top 0.1% have become richer while those at the bottom have gone underwater. And again, there are huge wealth disparities. Typically, Black and Latinx households had 5 to 10 cents on a dollar for every dollar of net worth in white households. And this particular study from Urban Institute follows the same households over time. So they start out between 1983, when they're in their 30s to 40s, having about 3 times more, white households having about 3 times more than Black households. But those same families over time, the wealth increases. So by the time you get to 2013, it's 11 times more wealth in white households on average than in Black households. So that means over time, the wealth inequality gets worse, even within particular households. And so this is some work I've done looking at children who were born in 2001. So these are the children who are in college now, right? So they were more likely to be born in households that are above the poverty line, or actually above 1.85 of the poverty line, have multiple assets if they're white and Asian households. But if they're in Black, Native American, Latinx, or American Indian households, it's just the opposite. They're more likely to be below 1.85% of the poverty line, and they don't have all the assets that were measured. So they're less likely to have a home or money in the bank or stocks and bonds. And so you can see the household you're born into also predicts whether you're more likely to be in a financially advantaged or disadvantaged household. And so if we look at these kind of national level trends and increasing economic inequality, the question becomes, what are some things you can do at the community level? And so the Office of Community Services and Planning actually gives some examples of, if you're a nonprofit organization, there's some things you can do yourself. There may be some things you want to partner with others, or you may want to refer. And so the types of things that they suggest are things we already talked about, like financial education, financial coaching, financial counseling. Sometimes just focus on credit counseling. If really the problem is really around credit card debt, credit building. So if you're someone who's never had a credit card and isn't able to break into having access to credit, a way to build your credit over time, or if maybe you've had bankruptcy or something and you're trying to build your credit back, sometimes there's ways to do that. You want to have access to safe and affordable financial products. And actually, the CFPB, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, was actually started because there had been so many financial products that were difficult to understand that probably led to the foreclosure crisis between 2007 2009. So the question is, how can you make sure low to moderate income households have access to safe and affordable financial products, particularly mortgages? Another service that nonprofits can provide is free tax preparation assistance called VITA sites. So rather than having to pay a tax preparer to get your taxes done, you can go to one of these free tax preparation assistants, and they can also provide guidance, rules of thumb and financial guidance going into the new year. As we mentioned before, helping people access federal and state benefits. Then there's also incentivized savings programs. I'm going to talk about them in just a second, but they're also things that people offer. So individual development accounts, child development accounts, and asset owners put $10 in. It's matched with $30. You have $40 in your individual development account. What's important here is it has to be used for an asset building purpose. So usually it's to buy a home, to pay for education, or to start a small business, sometimes for retirement. And again, there was an Assets for Independence program that was at the federal level through HHS. It hasn't been funded for the last 3 years, but there still are, through philanthropic sources and other things, places where these individual development accounts exist. But again, it's a way for people who are earning below the poverty line or twice the poverty line to have some incentives to save and to build assets over time. And I guess I'll say one more thing before I move on. Even though individual development accounts have been in communities throughout the country, one of the things that I spend a lot of time working on is child development accounts. And if there's questions about this, we could talk about it later. But rather than waiting for someone to be earning less than twice the poverty line, or to not know how they're going to pay for college or buy a home or do something else, is it possible that at the state level or at the city level, you can actually create an asset building account for every child, sometimes at birth, sometimes starting in kindergarten or preschool. And that way, the child has a chance to have that money grow and build interest over time. And if they save and can learn about savings, or have other incentive opportunities at the local level, they can have as much as $5,000 to $10,000 when they become 18 to 21 to use for school or for some asset building purpose. So those are sort of ideas that people are thinking about and have been piloted, but don't exist nationwide. But in countries like Singapore and Israel and other places, they do exist nationwide. So again, if there's questions about child development accounts, I can say more at the end. So increasing opportunities for households to succeed. What are some things that we can do? So there's some things in the financial tech or fintech world. There are ways to, find what stores use EBT cards or using at markets, at open markets, or things like that. They have ways that you can use apps to help you reach your goals, to help you track your income expenses, to make the most of the available money you have and use it towards your goals, and to have customized guidance and reminders. And so there's all sorts of apps and financial tech ways to help people improve their financial standing and to get into a point of financial stability. There are places that help with credit. So they sometimes employers offer employee loans at lower interest rates than you'd find like at a payday lender. And there's places that you put a little bit of money on your card and you pay that money back over time. And it's a way to establish a credit, particularly if you have had bankruptcy or don't have a credit history. There's credit products that help low to moderate income families. And there's all sorts of savings things. So there's nonprofits in San Francisco like EarnStarter that helps people do savings. There's something called prize link savings that some banks and credit unions do. So if every time you make a deposit, you get an opportunity to win $1,000 or a TV set or whatever the prize is. And so even though not everyone wins the prize, everyone wins by saving regularly. And so those prize link savings have been piloted in a lot of places. So there's all sorts of things on increasing income, improving credit, increasing savings through apps and through community-based programs that can help people get started if they aren't able to do it on their own. There's all sorts of community-based models of innovation. There's worker-owned cooperatives. There's been studies that show particularly Black and Latinx women, if they're in a worker-owned cooperative, or have higher levels of wealth than their counterparts. Locally, in the Southeast Michigan, there's C2BE, the Center for Community-Based Enterprise, and they help people do worker-owned enterprises, worker-owned cooperatives. There's all sorts of community development corporations that help build wealth at the community level, that help people go into home ownership. There's local currency and bartering systems, so things like time banks, or helping people to not always have to spend money, but to barter. So you will, help me watch my child for a couple hours when I'm working, and then I'll help, cut your grass or braid your hair or do something else. So these kind of bartering systems can be helpful. And then there's these social purpose enterprises. So rather than just being there to make a profit, being there to help particular populations. So maybe hiring people who are recently released from prison, or veterans, or homeless, having some sort of corporate responsibility, maybe trying to help the environment, maybe putting money from their profits into a community-based fund or nonprofit. There's all sorts of things you can do at the community level to help increase the financial status of individuals who live in the community or who work in the community. And these are just stats about CDCs, the sort of things they do. They're located throughout the country. They do a lot of work in housing. They help create jobs. They help operate businesses. They help create commercial space. And they do equity investment in local businesses. So those are some of the roles that CDCs play throughout the country, community development corporations. Okay, this is toward the end. So there was something called MyRA through the US Department of Treasury. It was created by Obama, eliminated by Trump by executive order. Maybe it'll come back again. But what's nice about this is rather than having to go through your employer, so if your employer has a 401k program or a 403b program or some way to match your retirement savings, then you're doing well. If your employer doesn't have a retirement program, then you're out of luck. You can do an IRA on your own, but there's usually not a match, and it's usually not automatically done for you. So the MyRA was a way to offer workers who didn't have a retirement program to their employers a program that was administered by the Department of Treasury. There was an initial deposit of $25. There was automatic payroll deductions, no fees, and you'd get a modest rate of return in government securities. So it was a way to help people save for retirement if their employer didn't do so. Because in the US, many of our financial products and our health insurance are through employers. So if you happen to have an employer that has benefits, then you're fine. But if you're an independent contractor or you're with an employer that doesn't have those benefits, then you don't have access to these asset building tools. This is just one policy that helped people build wealth for retirement that could be reinstated or made universally available. The other big thing to think about in the US context is almost all money that goes to help people with asset building is through the tax system. So rather than doing redistribution and directly giving people money, you get refunds through your taxes. And the huge majority of the money that goes to tax incentives for asset building, so retirement, home ownership, it goes to the top 40% of taxpayers. Those at the bottom don't get any of that money. And so the question is, could we do better? Could we make all of this money that is being taken out of our tax system, but going toward those at the top to also help those at the bottom? So that's our upside down tax spending programs. And the question is, can we make that different? Can we make it more progressive? And so I will quickly go to what social workers can do thinking about issues of income inequality. So income inequality can lead to instability because you have volatile income. It could lead to having poor quality healthcare because you can't pay to afford co-pays or for payments. It may mean you have less access to transportation, less access to quality of mental health diagnosis and treatment. Your housing and community resources might be of lower quality, and your life aspirations might be different just because because of the income inequality that exists. And so for social workers, you want to be sensitive to these issues. You want to advocate for greater income equality. You want to work in the policy arena, and you want to work with clients to help them think about ways to increase their income like we talked about before. These are things social workers can do. When you're thinking about either policy or kind of the sorts of things that help with income inequality, help increasing wages. So some of the minimum wage, the advocate to increase minimum wage to $15 an hour, let's say. Also having hours that are predictable so that you are able to, aren't in trouble because of things like childcare, or you don't know what weeks you're going to work and it leads to income instability. It would be great if we could increase the earned income tax credit, because it's great for families who have children, but for families who don't have children or who are single, it doesn't do much for them at all. So can we expand EITC to cover more people? Something that exists in countries throughout the world, in the developed world, is a refundable tax credit, sometimes called a child allowance. So for every child, you might get $100 a month, $250 a month. That exists in countries throughout the world, but not in the US. Having better and more affordable childcare can make it easier for people to work. Investing in both public and private sector job creation, so that during times of unemployment, people have options. Expand unemployment insurance, which we did in Michigan during the pandemic. We'll see if it lasts. And then there's lots of proposals around universal basic income. So unlike child allowances, where it's only for people who have children, universal basic income means it's universal, so everybody below a certain income. It's basic, so you get a small amount, so whether it's $500 or $1,000 a month. And it's unconditional, which means that it's not based on you looking for jobs or you getting an education or doing something. It's universal basic to make sure that people have enough money to live on and not to have extreme circumstances. So again, there's lots of pilots in the US now around universal basic income. We'll see what happens. When you're thinking about wealth inequality, there's just some key concepts to keep in mind. One, income is distinct from wealth. So it's possible to have high income and low wealth. It's possible to have low income and higher wealth, even though that doesn't tend to be the case. But if people had greater income, even with lower wealth, even if people had higher wealth, even with lower income, you're more able to have slack and make ends meet. So just remembering that income is distinct from wealth. They're both highly unequal in the US, but they are different. Wealth is even more extreme. And we're not going to go into this. I didn't show the slides on this, but just understanding the typical wealth portfolio. So if you're looking at businesses, stocks and bonds, high in wealth, it's only those at the top. The typical household of the US, maybe a little bit of money in the bank, maybe a car or some kind of vehicle. Historical and current trends for inequality. Historic policies help shape inequality. I've done some work on the Homestead Act. So it was a time when the country gave lots of land, 160 acres, to European immigrants that were coming through, but Native Americans and newly freed, formerly enslaved African Americans didn't get that land. And so from a period from like 1860 to 1960, it was an opportunity for immigrant groups to increase their wealth, but other groups didn't. And those sort of things lead to what Tom Shapiro and Melvin Oliver called a sedimentation of inequality. So it starts to have a cumulative effect over generations. For social workers, it's important to understand that wealth helps shape opportunity in big and small ways. The kind of rates that you get on cars and homes and education loans can be shaped by how much wealth you already have. Economic justice is a ripe area for advocacy because it's where there's so much work that needs to be done. And then some of the things I talked about at the end, considering community asset building as a potential strategy. And some ways, if you're thinking about policy, cease privileging income from capital over income from labor. So the way our country works, you pay less taxes on capital gains than you do on what you earn in wages. And so why should that be? Because mostly those who get capital gains, those are the top. And then you also want more inclusive asset building policy. So a lot of the tax refunds that go for retirement and housing go to those at the top, 40%, as I said. And so how can we have retirement that's ready for everybody, like that MyRA and other ways to make sure that everybody has a chance to have incentives to save for retirement. And there's a home mortgage income deduction. And so people who own a home, and particularly those who have homes that are very expensive, that cost a lot of money, they get much more back in tax refunds. So can we have some sort of wealth building subsidy for people who have lower value homes, or people even who rent, because they usually have more volatility than those at the top. So how can we be more inclusive in our asset building and how money in our country flows for asset building? Those to the top, usually not toward those at the bottom. We need to reverse that. Supporting micro enterprise and cooperative businesses and cooperative development can help, particularly at low income and moderate income communities. And then of course, creating child savings accounts for all children at birth can make a huge difference, because that means that regardless of the wealth and income of your parents, everyone can start with a nest egg. And people like Cory Booker have announced baby bonds that have had, generous amounts, so that by the time a very low income child reaches 18 or 21, they may have as much as $20,000 in a trust fund in their name. So again, these are ideas that have been piloted in many places, including the US and in other countries, but aren't universally available at the moment. When you're thinking about building wealth in low income communities, I think it's really important to keep in mind, because people say, oh yeah, people ought to stop buying tennis shoes, and people ought to just manage their money better. But individual prudence can be helpful. It can make a difference on the margin, but careful budgeting is not going to be enough to overcome years of intergenerational disadvantage and the structural inequities that make sure that money and income is increasing at the top and is stagnant at the bottom. So yes, financial education can be helpful. Yes, doing financial counseling can make a difference. But if we don't have policy and structural change, helping people budget better isn't going to change this increasing inequality that we have in the United States. So progressive policies, innovative programs are what we need to make a difference. And then rather than emphasizing survival and consumption, priority also must be given to economic development and capacity building for all people, particularly those at low and moderate incomes, because they're the ones who are usually left out of incentives for saving and asset building. And this is my last slide before I turn it over to you for questions. So a colleague and I, Stephanie Body, we came up with this model for building wealth across the income distribution. I'm not even going to talk about high income today, because they usually have tax accountants and lawyers who can help them think about all the things they can do. But when you're thinking about low to moderate income households, there's household level things that could be done. So things we talk about like IDAs, investing EITC refunds, and not spending it all, having some sort of match savings around that, having home ownership programs to make sure that people get favorable loans and have assistance if they're low income, getting the down payments, having employer-based retirement programs, having more people use individual retirement accounts that's through the federal government. Middle income households might do things around real estate. The State College 529 plan, which is what most people use right now to save for their children's college education. Only about 4 to 5% of families use that, and it tends to be those at the high end. If you had a child development account program or a baby bond program where everybody received a 529 plan, then it would be more universal and reach more people. If you're thinking about some of the community level things, shared risk pools for insurance. Anyone who lives in Detroit knows that people who live in cities, and particularly in Detroit, often pay more for their car insurance and sometimes their home insurance. And so if at the low income, you can have pools so that people who are in a particular community-based group or in a particular church maybe can get a reduced rate for their insurance. Housing cooperatives, so rather than getting an individual mortgage and buying a home as an individual household, having multiple households moving in together, or having some sort of condo, but having it at a way so it's easier to get in, but having housing cooperatives as a way to build wealth before people are maybe in a position to buy a home for themselves, just as an individual. Investment clubs are things that people have used. So everybody puts in $10 a week or $10 a month. Somebody picks a stock that they investigate. And it's a way to get people thinking about the stock market, since again, those the low income usually don't have investments in the stock market. Micro enterprise And I've already talked about CDCs and limited liability corporations. So different ways of doing business so that it helps low to moderate income families and not just wealthy people and shareholders. And so again, I could talk for a long time about a lot of these things, but I just want people to think about what are some ways to help build wealth. So it's not always what you think. There are a lot of innovative pilots that are out there. There are a lot of things that nonprofits and community-based organizations, block clubs can do. I mean, there's all sorts of things people try to do to kind of think about how can we increase our own financial stability and our own financial well-being, as well as try to build things up for questions. And if you ever want to reach me, here's my email address and my Twitter handle. I guess now I will stop sharing my screen and I will respond to questions or comments or whatever people want to say or do.
They should be able to unmute, I think.
People
No.
are starting to put their goals too. Taking this workshop was a beginning goal to work on increasing my stability and working on my mobility. So great. My goal is to take some money each check and put it in a savings account. I would like to learn more about investing. Good. Pay myself first and everybody else next. And then how do you feel about having an Acorns account? I don't know if I know what an Acorns account is. Can you, whoever asked that question, can you say a little more about that or put it in the chat?
I did give them the ability to unmute themselves, so they should be able to do that.
Acorns is an app that it rounds to the nearest dollar the money that you're spending and invests it. So if like a bill is 95 cents, it takes that extra 5 cents and puts it into it's an app.
Mhm.
I think Ashton Kutcher actually is helped found it. I don't know.
Is it through a bank or is it just something you can download on your phone on your own?
Download on your phone.
Awesome. Well, look up Acorns. And I assume at some point you have to choose which investment you're most interested in, and then you'll put a little bit toward it each time you make a purchase.
I think it lets you pick like mild, medium, or aggressive on which category you want to invest in.
So that's an example of one of those fintech solutions that people might learn about and experiment with if you want to kind of play with a low risk way of investing and getting into this area. And then you also don't have to consciously save or invest. It does it for you, which is nice. Just one thing I probably should say, one of the things that my dissertation chair, Michael Schrotten, who came up with that IDA account idea, he really strongly advocates for institutional solutions. So the reason that people who are at the top 1% save and have more wealth isn't so much they're smarter and they invest better or they're somehow so much more astute, but usually they have things with their employers that do it automatically, so they get an automatic match and every month it just goes into their accounts, or they have a financial advisor who sets things up and does things automatically, does it for them. And so really they're just reaping the benefit from a decision made by their parents or a long time ago, and they have the benefit of compound interest if their money grows over time. And so if you could help everyone have institutional ways of saving and building assets, which of course, if everyone has a child account or if people have access to IDAs, then it's not just for those at the top who either have people advising them or have institutional actors who do things on their behalf, but it's something that low and moderate income families can benefit from too. So this idea of an Acorn account or some sort of a way that automatically puts money aside for you without you having to every day go and click on something or make a deposit or go through a broker and purchase a stock, that makes it much easier for you to invest and to plan for your future. So thank you for that suggestion and that idea. Okay, now I've totally missed the chat, so please read.
I'd like to just bring up Chantalea Johns. Dr. Johns is going to regulate our question and answer. Dr. Johns is director of our continuing education program. So Dr. Johns, you want to step forward?
Thank you so much. I was able to gather a lot of the questions from our chat and I organized them based on your presentation.
Okay.
So I want to start with a couple of the questions around individual financing.
Mhm.
One participant asked, in what settings do you think social workers should provide financial counseling directly to clients as opposed to referring them to a financial counselor?
Well, if you're not certified and you don't know much about it, it's always better to refer than to just play with this yourself. But like, that's why I said, if you're interested, there are places you can go to learn more, get certified, and make sure that you're kind of, not that you have to be official. You can always give, rules of thumb or loose advice. But for people who are really struggling, you want someone who knows all the tools that are possible to use. Locally, there's something called Center for Working Families that has a really strong financial coaching model. And so that's a good place to refer people to. The Wayne County Community Action Agency, they do a lot of work around financial capability. They used to have IDA accounts. I haven't looked lately, but they're a place that would be a good reference. So I think if you're giving a rule of thumb, or you're just kind of looking for some of those red flags to see how people are doing financially, any kind of intake is fine. But if you get to the point where people are actually struggling and you actually want to give concrete advice, you want to either be credited or refer to them someone who does this kind of as
Right.
their job.
Thank you so much. The next question is around client shame with regards to talking about their finances. Is there any tips for us to talk to our clients who may be ashamed about the large amount of debt that they may have accumulated over the years?
That is such a good question.
Great question.
Well, two things I like to say. One, historically, social workers were the one who did a lot of work with budgeting and financing, but over time, we are less and less likely to do that, and it's been kind of left to bankers and others. And I think if anyone can do this in a way that has culture of humility and that is appropriate, I think social workers are probably better than just a random banker or someone who is maybe in it for themselves and not always for the client's best interest. So I think historically, social workers used to do that a lot more. But this idea of shame, I think that's why it's really important, particularly if someone is at a crisis mode, to go to someone who's trained. That's really important because they know how to kind of loosen the conversation. They kind of can start out with things that are on paper as opposed to having someone, admit. So if you have someone, let's say, do a budget for a month, when they come back, you realize, oh, how come you paid so much for this? Oh, because I had this huge credit card bill that I have to pay off. And that gives you a way to talk about things without it just being, spontaneous people admitting. There's like a process that you can go through. But I agree that even in families, talking about money is a really difficult. And so that's why kind of having more and more opportunities to share information and to start the conversation is really important, because usually people aren't going to admit to it unless someone helps them feel comfortable doing it, if that makes sense. Because people are embarrassed. And just like for some people, what they do and what their job is who they are. If they are struggling financially, it makes them feel like they're failing in some way. And so my point would be, it's always better to get help and to talk about it, just like with mental health. With financial health, it's better to get help and actually talk about it than to ignore it and have it get worse. Hope that answered the question.
Thank you so much. Yeah. Excellent. Thank you. So we want to, it's quite a few questions about student loan debt.
Yeah.
One in particular, this participant categorized student loan debt as good debt, and the student wanted to know when does that become excessive?
With this audience, this is a really tough question because many people, students are going through this right now. I'd say the reason it's considered good debt is if it's the difference between getting an education and not getting an education. Student debt can be a good thing because it can allow you to be in a position where you have a degree and over time can earn more money. That's why it's considered good debt. But once you've been accepted into a school program and you're making decisions month to month, semester to semester, you want to have the smallest amount of debt possible that you can still get your degree. And so I actually mentioned this in the small group I was in. There's a lot of people who they've paid for their tuition, they've paid for their books, but it's getting to be the end of the semester and they just don't have a lot of money. So they might go in and get another loan. And it might seem, okay, that extra $1,000, that extra $2,000, not that big a deal and it'll help me, you know, live a little more easily. But if you do that every semester over 8 semesters, that's another, you know, $16,000 that you have to pay, that at the end you have to pay back. And so I guess the biggest thing about student loan debt is if it helps you to get your degree and you have to get some student debt, it's not always a bad thing, but you want to have the least amount possible to actually successfully complete. And the worst thing you can do is get student loans and don't get your degree. So you don't want to drop out. And my computer said it's getting ready to go out. Let me plug it in really quickly before I turn it off. Okay. Good. I think we should be back. Yeah. Okay. But anyways, but I think, you know, get the least amount as possible. And if possible, just like you are budgeting your income, you want to budget your student loans too, so that you try to make it last for the whole semester and not keep getting more and more. That's at least a starting point. But I think even better when you are a junior and senior in high school, or when you're contemplating a degree, making sure that as you're looking at the different places you're applying to, you're seeing what the whole package is, and you're going to a place where you're going to have the least amount of debt possible is a bigger picture answer to that. But I think that getting good advice for people who really understand the student loan process and the different options that are available to help think it through before you're signing on the dotted line, it can help you make more informed choices, even around student debt.
Thank you. So now we want to move to your part of the presentation where you talked about inequalities. There were a few questions in that area as well.
Okay.
One of them actually is along the same lines with what we're talking about. One participant highlighted a study from CSWE that examined social work student loan debt, particularly around students of color. And so the participant wanted to know, had you seen that study and maybe your thoughts on how students of color in social work seem to be having a larger amount of student debt than other students?
I'm familiar with those numbers. People of color have more student debt over time, and they're also more likely to have, even if it's a small amount of debt, but maybe not get the degree. So that means that they have the debt and they have to pay it back, but they don't actually have the benefit of it. And the other thing to think about, for many people of color, getting a degree is like a lifetime goal, almost like home ownership for some people, right? And so you think about, I want to get the house, I want to get the top university possible. And so I'm going to do whatever I can to get it, even if it means that I have to get a big debt and I can't really afford to pay for it right now. And so the question is the likely benefit in terms of earnings over time going to allow you to pay that in a way that makes it worthwhile? So maybe rather than going to the most expensive private school, you may want to go to a school in your town where you don't have to pay the room and board. And so just thinking about ways, so even though it seems good on the surface, yes, I finally got a mortgage and I'm going to buy a house, but it's twice the rate as other people. And is that a good deal? Maybe I could wait a few more years to have a bigger down payment. Same thing for student debt. Do you want to get the degree at any price? Or is there a way to either postpone or go to a different place or not have quite as much loan, or maybe even work a little more, even though I know that makes it tough because you're working and studying, it's harder to maintain your grades. But just don't take the max amount of debt possible because you can. Figure out, are there other ways to get to your goal without getting as much debt? That debt hampers people of color for longer because of this very thing. And I know that's not a great answer, except for, just make the best choices possible you can with what you have. But the other thing too is if you do have student debt, see if you can find ways to get some of it dismissed if you work in certain fields. just or do what you can, because once you have it, it's not like it's going to go away. But just figure out using the principles we talked about to, slowly work your way out of the debt if you have it. And then if you don't have it yet, don't get more than you might be able to successfully pay back given the likely jobs you're going to get.
Thank you. And the tools you provided to us are definitely things for us to chew on as students think about acquiring debt while they're in college. I think we have time for more questions. So we know there's a pay inequality as it relates to females receiving less pay than males, and especially in female dominant professions. So there's a question that wants some tips on when we're looking at the pay inequality and particularly around women of color. Do you have any tips for us being able to advocate for better pay?
That's an important question. So there's advocating for yourself and being able to negotiate raises and things. That's tough at the individual level. The best way to do it, I always think in terms of institutions. Some institutions actually look at pay across race and gender, and like every 3 or 4 years, bump people up who haven't had the same. It's kind of looking at equity increases. And so if you could get employers or institutions to do that, that's even better. So obviously, if the individual can advocate for themselves, can negotiate a raise, can try to get more, and that on the margin might help. But if systematically, let's say at a university or an institution or a corporation, women and people of color are earning less, and you see that year after year after year, person after person after person, then you can build in some of those equity equalizers to make sure that that doesn't continue to be the case over time. So in addition to individuals advocating for themselves or advocating for one another, if you can find institutional ways to reduce some of those inequities, that's even better. But again, this is a big societal problem. That's a trite answer, because it's a big problem.
Of course, yes, but we always like to bring it up so that we can continue to have conversations about it. I believe there's some questions or folks that have their hands up who would like to ask a question. I'm being told that.
And someone put that if you are a fully licensed master level social worker, you have the opportunity to have your student loans reduced or eliminated if you work at a federally qualified health center. So there's opportunity to reduce that at the federal level, and then there's stuff like this. So thank you for that bit of information. Oh, and there's a good question I saw. You tell me.
Go ahead.
Should high schools teach some of this stuff? There are some states that have a required financial education course, and that does seem to make a difference. But I would say as much information that young people can have to make choices about career and college and post-secondary, whatever they're going to do, could be so important. Because right now, there's so few counselors in schools. They barely can get the recommendation letters out, let alone provide really good detailed counseling. And so if nonprofits can help do that, or mentors can help do that, or churches can help do that, providing some of that, people to talk to and solid information, because it's some of the biggest decisions people are going to make it, and they usually make it when they're really young. And if they're first generation, so their families didn't go to college, they just don't. There's a vacuum of information. So if it could be taught in school, great. Or if there's other local community-based ways to help people make better choices, both about what they're going to do after high school and how they're going to pay for it, it would make life a lot better.
I have a question.
Yes.
Joanne.
I'm sorry, we have some folks with their hands up, and then we'll
okay.
get to it. Is the person named Pat? You had your hand raised for a while. Did you want to ask your question?
Yeah, Dr. Shanks, your email and phone went past so fast I couldn't catch it. Can you give us that again?
Is it okay if I share my screen again just to show that part?
Yes.
Yeah, let's do that. If I can do it, let's see. Okay, can you see it now? So TRWILLI@umich.edu, and then Trina Shanks 1 is my Twitter handle.
Got it.
I'm so happy that we have so many questions here. Elaine, I believe your hand was raised next.
Yeah, so I had a question earlier and we went into the breakout rooms. I asked it. So it's kind of like a two-part question. So when you were talking about the 40% spent on 40% income spent on homes, and that should be the limit. My experience is mostly working with homeless clients who have to spend the majority of their income on their homes that they receive from Section 8 because of all the gentrification and the landlords who are hiring the prices. So how would I help them with their income? And like, what advice could I give them to help them with their income when they have to spend the majority on it, whether they want to or not, because of housing is just so expensive now?
Yeah, affordable housing is a problem. And the thing that's interesting is it's less of a problem in Michigan and other places, but it's still a problem everywhere. Let me say two things. So one, I think the fact that we have ceded home ownership to the market and don't have a lot of government options. I mean, there's a little bit of public housing, a little bit of Section 8, but the waiting lists are so long. So the fact that speculators can come and, whether it's through gentrification or whether it's through, buying and rehabbing houses, it's like the market is controlling housing when really government should have either a floor, you should never pay more than a certain amount of your income in rent, or there's affordable options for those who are struggling economically. But right now, everybody's kind of on their own and the market is kind of what determines prices. So unless there were some of those things I talked about, like for right now, there's tax benefits that go to people who buy homes over a certain amount if they have to pay money in taxes, but there's nothing that goes to the bottom. So there could be some sort of a tax refund or a assistance to renters or subsidies that aren't so hard to get. It would make life better for everybody. But right now, the US government doesn't put a lot of money and resources into affordable housing. And just to give you an example, a country like Singapore, 80% of the country lives in public housing. So it's not like something that is for, it's not something that's marginalized and not something that's stigmatized. I mean, college professors, working people across the income spectrum are in subsidized housing. And so I don't think it has to be, that extreme here in the US, but if we had more options through the public sector and that people aren't going to be so dependent on what's happening in the private sector, I think that would make things a lot better.
So like the two-part thing was like the majority of the clients that I see are African American, and it's because it's based in Detroit. So when someone was asking for loans, and you said like try, instead of going to a private school, go to like a public school in your area. My question is, what if the schools available don't offer the same opportunities, and where does that lead you? So I'm just thinking like what decisions, like what priorities should be made over what?
Well, that's why allowing someone to talk through their options. Should I give my personal example? I'll give one. So I got accepted to an Ivy League school. And when I asked them how much money they give me for financial aid, they said, oh, we can't tell you yet. You have to accept first and you'll figure out financial aid later. And I'm like, well, that isn't very, that's not a very good position to put me in. And so I ended up not going. And I went to a perfectly good school. It's not like, but for me, some people would say going to the Ivy League school is so important. It doesn't matter what, whatever package they give me, I'll go. But for me, I said, you know what, I'd rather go where I had a scholarship and didn't have to pay, who knows what, than go to that Ivy League school. That's a choice I made. For some people, maybe the career they want to go into or the person they want to work with, I mean, maybe it really is important to get that particular degree at that particular place, and you have at least some chance of earning a high wage afterwards. And so that's an individual calculus. I can't say
Yeah.
a rule of thumb, this is what you should do. this is what you
I'm just thinking of like Detroit Public Schools and how like it's very like low income, low, like not enough supplies and things like that. And it's just sad.
That's why I spent a lot of emphasis thinking about what can you do working with low to moderate income communities, because that's where investment usually isn't made. And that's where options usually are more limited. So the question is, what can we do as social workers, as policymakers, to take these areas that have been less invested in and figure out how can we build financial capability of individuals, but also of the community. And part of that would be education and housing, as well as some of the other things we're talking about. So you're right, that's the inequality that exists. It exists between individuals, but it also exists across communities.
Thank you.
No, thank you for your question.
And there's a question that wants to be posed to you from Tranisa Booker.
I guess my question is not so, I don't know. So I'm just gonna say it, with so many, like due to COVID, so many, it's actually women being affected with, it's more women that has lost their jobs like due to the COVID. And it might be a little off subject, but seeing that there's a lot of social workers here on this meeting and, you know, things in that sort, and we're talking about financial literacy, have you happened to even think of the plan for the aftermath of this, you know, the pandemic, what's going on with so many women now, with already having inequality with income, and now so many more women, you know, are without jobs now. Do you have any like opinion on that by any chance?
You say that. So just on Friday, I was on part of a panel at SSWR, the Society for Social Work and Research, that really was talking about that. So at this moment, it's a time to think big, right? So just to give a little bit, so we looked historically, and it turns out after a Great Recession or after an economic downturn, typically those at the top recover quicker. And sometimes there's actually political and racial unrest, and that's exactly what we see during this time. And so the question is, rather than doing what's always happened in the past, so when the economy recovers, those at the top recover first, those at the bottom, if they recover at all, take longer. How can we figure out how to do that better? So a lot of the things that I talked about in terms of reducing wealth inequality and income inequality could do that, but they have to be funded. And so in the past, people have said, oh, it's too expensive to give every child $1,000, or it's too much money to help people with rental assistance. People need to be able to support themselves, and we don't want to create dependency. But I mean, we've seen in the past, year that when Congress wants to spend billions and trillions of dollars, they can. The question is, what are they going to do it on? And so my take would be guaranteed employment and infrastructure, universal child allowances or child accounts so that every child has at least their basic needs met. Something around having housing as a right, even water as a right, so that people aren't left on the streets or homeless or evicted every 3 months, which causes so much instability for families and children. But those things cost money. And so if we want to make the same kind of investment we've done in, restoring businesses and restoring Wall Street into making families whole, we have to decide that's what we want to spend money on. But it can't be the cheap and stingy ways we've done before in the past with things like TANF and welfare. It needs to be ways that really do help all of us become more financially secure. And so there's lots of ideas and lots of pilots around this, but the question is, what do we have the financial will to do?
Well, we've really enjoyed this session. I'm going to turn it over now to Dean Kubiak to give us final remarks and close us out.
Dr. Shanks, I can't thank you enough for this presentation. I think that it's been one of the few presentations that we've had where we've got the same number of people at the beginning as we have in the end, which just tells us what an important topic this is for our community. We'd love to invite you back again. We know that you've agreed to meet with some of our faculty and colleagues on campus to talk more in depth about this issue and about what we can do at Wayne State around these issues. But we agree with you that there needs to be a social work response for social workers as a profession. You know, we think about the debt that social work students go into a relatively low wage field to help others, and the inequity of that, and how do we remedy that? But also, how do we as social workers remedy some of the social ills and the choices that we are making as a country so that there isn't the income inequality that we experience today? So thank you so much for bringing so much light to this topic and giving us some wonderful strategies. I think this will be the first of many conversations that we have going forward. So thank you again. I also want to say to those of you who are here for continuing education credits, there will be a small survey that will be sent to you. So please stay tuned for that. So again, Dr. Shanks, thank you so much for taking time to bring your practice experience and wisdom to all of us.
You're very welcome. Have a great afternoon, everybody. Thanks for letting me do this. I enjoyed it too.
Thank you all. Take care. And thank you for being here today.
You're welcome.
Bye.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.